biology. We're going to finish up chapter 16 today. And remember, our last video talked about the process of speciation. There's 3 different ways we could form a new species. And so we ended with talking about how the different finches on the Galapagos Islands all were derived from one ancestral species, and they changed to 13 species. And now we're going to look at how we actually can test this and prove this. So we actually have had modern experiments done to see if this process, specifically with the beaks of the finches, actually does work. And so how we did this, well, not we personally, but how scientists did this, was by the people named of Peter and Rosemary Grant. So these are 2 important people. They tested Darwin's hypothesis, which relied on 2 testable assumptions. So they could assume these things, and they were testable to prove that evolution did in fact occur by natural selection. So for their first assumption that they could make was that for beak size and shape to evolve, there must be enough heritable variation in those traits to provide raw material for natural selection. So that just means that there's enough genes that control the size of beaks that they can change and show that natural selection isn't in fact occurring. And then differences in beak size and shape must produce differences in fitness, causing natural selection to occur. So what it's saying is that there has to be one beak type that gives an organism a better chance to survive and reproduce and pass on their genes than another beak size. So they can test those 2 things. So what they did is they tested these hypotheses on the medium ground finch. So that's what they studied. They studied the medium ground finch, and the island they did was Daphne Major, so it's just one of the 20 islands that are one of the 20 little islands that make up the whole Galapagos chain. And what they did to start was they kind of knew that during the rainy season on this island, there's plenty of food. So during the rainy season, there's plenty of food, no real competition going on. However, during droughts, our food becomes scarce. So that's when survival of the fittest is going to start to kick in, because only birds that are best suited to eat the food that is available will survive. And so then individual birds with different sized beaks had different chances of survival during a drought, which is what I just said. So in order to kind of keep moving on here, is that when food was scarce, individuals with large beaks were more likely to survive. So if we look on the bottom here, we have the size of the beak in millimeters. And so if we look, about 0% of the birds that only had a beak size of 6 millimeters survived that drought. So they were unable to really eat the food that was available during this time when food was scarce. And so they all died out. They did not pass on their genes. And so our larger beak birds with a beak size of, looks like above it, around 13 millimeters, about half of them survived again during the time of drought. So there are going to be ones that die, but the ones that are surviving more are the larger beaks. So that large beak gene stays inside of our gene pool. They pass it on, and then just over time we have an average beak size increases in our finches. And so through this testing, the Grants provided evidence of the process of evolution. So they literally have evidence for evolution. It is a process that occurs over millions of years, but they kind of showed it on a smaller scale, and it proved to us that beak size can in fact be changed by natural selection. And so to finish up this chapter, we're going to look at how specifically, again, this applied to the speciation, which again, the formation of a new species in the Galapagos finches. So that's what we're going to finish up on, which again is kind of tying in to the experiment that the Grants did. So there's 5 things had to occur in order for our Galapagos finches to form a new species. They had to found a new population. Remember, we talked about genetic drift and the founder effect. There had to be geographic isolation, so there had to be some type of barrier separating our 2 populations. And there had to be changes in our new population's gene pool. There had to be reproductive isolation then, so then they could no longer mate with the founding group. And then there had to be some type of competition. And so our first step was a few finches, species A is what we're going to call them. They traveled from South America to one of the Galapagos Islands. So we can remember Galapagos Islands are 600 miles off the coast of South America. And so we look over there in the picture on the right, you can see our finch is moving. Again, if a big storm blew through, it could carry them all the way over to these islands. And so once they land there, they survive and they reproduce. So they start a colony or a population of finches. And so once they make it to there, some birds from species A cross to a second island. So they island hop. If you remember, that was another word that was used in the video. So they hop islands, and then there the two populations no longer share a gene pool. So they're living on different islands, they're not interbreeding with one another, so they're not sharing genes. And so then seed sizes on the second island favor birds with larger beaks. So once the original species, they island hopped over to B, so therefore a population on the second island will evolve into population B with larger sized beaks. So that's basically how it occurs. So we have our parent population is A, they originally came over, a group from A jumped over to a different island, and since there was larger seed sizes there, so there's larger beaks, so we now have a completely new species with a larger size beak than what we did before. And then if population B birds, they'll cross back to the first island, they will not mate with birds from population A. So therefore that's our reproductive isolation there, and so populations A and B are now separate species altogether. And then competition will occur. So as species A and B compete for the seeds on the first island, they will continue to evolve in a way that increases the differences between them. So again, one has a larger beak, so it's going to keep evolving a larger beak in order to try and be more successful. And so then, as a result of all this new competition, a new species, C, may evolve altogether, and that process happened over and over again, to where now there's 13 different species of finches on these island chains, just based off the type of food that is available on each island. And so evolution today isn't continuing, so this process of isolation, which we just discussed, and genetic change and reproductive isolation probably repeated itself often across the entire Galapagos island chain, which is what I just said, because now we have 13 different species, and we'll also mention the shells of the tortoises are different, so that's occurring all the time. And so studying evolution since Darwin. So the grants we mentioned earlier, they did some work on evolution, and scientific evidence now supports the theory that living species descended with modification from common ancestors that lived in the ancient past, and then scientists predict that as new fossils are found, they will continue to expand our understanding of how species evolve. So we have been studying it, and again, scientific evidence is backing it up more and more each day that this actually has occurred throughout nature. So that is it for the chapter 16. Let me know if you have any questions.